Oh, hi, everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of Supply Chain Talk. Great that you're joining us today. My name is Duncan Brock. I'm a director at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, and I've got the pleasure of hosting Supply Chain Talk today. Really interesting topic we're going to move on today. It's all about looking at how to eliminate slavery across your supply chain. And I'm going to be joined by three excellent guests who are really experts and also passionate about this topic to be able to join me and take this through. Last week, we talked about going digital for last mile delivery, which was a very different topic. I brought in a lot of aspects about logistics and sustainability in that area. But also last week, every week we cover a news story. And last week's news story was about looking at the impact of the conflict in Ukraine and Russia and what that might do to supply chains, and probably pertinent to where we are today, that actually not only is that turning into reality, but the people issue, but also the supply chain issues are clearly going to be at the forefront of our thoughts as we go forward. So let's keep an eye on that as we go through. But anyway, come back to today. Today is going to be about looking at modern slavery and the issues associated with that. Please do join us, those who are live, to join us by using the chat and to be using the Q&A. I already see that a few people have put in the chat, so hello to you, Mark and John. Great to see everyone again. And Trudy and Helen, James from London, Blaron from Supply Chain Talk. Thanks for joining us all. And it'd be good to see a few others put your comments in the chat. Please engage in the discussion through the chat, because it's really good to be able to join you in that. I'll also look for questions from you. So any thoughts you've got or questions for the guests, please use the Q&A part of the platform to ask those questions, and I'll try and make sure that we have some time through this session to answer most of them as we go through. So please engage with us. Those of you who haven't seen before, if you do engage with us and you have a really good question or comment in the chat, we've got this great Supply Chain Talk mug, which we then give to the best person who's added the chat or comments. So a little incentive to you to join in with us today. So that's what we're going to cover today. I'm going to bring in the first guest. Our first guest is David Pettit, who's the Global Human Rights and Sustainability Supply Chain Director at Reckitt. So David, welcome to you. Thanks for joining us on this session. And I know the topic here is really at the heart of everything that you do at Reckitt and your role. But maybe let's just start with you giving a very quick introduction to yourself.
Sure, Duncan. No, pleasure to be here today and to talk on the panel. So I'm David Pettit. I'm the Global Human Rights and Sustainable Supply Chain Director at Reckitt. And what I do, in effect, is work with our passionate colleagues around the world in order to ensure that we respect human rights across our entire value chain of our business, but also then work primarily with our procurement colleagues to ensure that we embed sustainability into just how we buy and procure the raw materials that go into our products. A little intro into Reckitt. For those who don't know Reckitt, we are a global consumer health, hygiene and nutrition company that manufacture a range of brands, including Dettol, Durex, Spretzels, etc.
And when did you move from Reckitt Benckiser to just be Reckitt's? I know the rebranding takes place.
Sure, no, that happened last year. And yeah, it was a huge lift from the team to obviously rebrand the corporate brand. But yeah, it's a far more short, succinct, memorable name that sort of represents the heritage of the company and the founders over 100 years ago.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, David. So let's kick off the discussion. And what we do in Supply Chain Talk is we use a news article, a topical one on procurement and supply chain to bring it to life. And there's an article that we're going to sort of use this week, which was in the Procurement magazine last week. And the title was sort of Shiseido Strengthens Sustainable Procurement with Suppliers. The reason we picked this is because it had a very interesting focus, because what this Japanese company is doing is really looking to put in place a revised group procurement policy, which actively promotes sustainable and responsible procurement in its suppliers. I'm trying to get my words right. They also focus, as you probably would expect with a Japanese company, on real valuing the partnerships and collaboration they have with the suppliers. But I think also there was teeth to this new policy where they're talking about having a real strict objective to identify risk, to have a correction process through third-party audits, and really probably giving a lot more teeth and structure. And I think what was interesting for us when we looked at this article, and I'd be really interested in your thoughts, David, is that actually there's a lot of companies who are talking about what they will do about modern slavery, and they've made their statements of the things they will do, but there's not a lot of evidence of a lot of companies actually then getting on and starting to embed those things forward. And I know something that, as you said, within your role in Reckitt, you're quite passionate about. So, I mean, this approach from this company and maybe linking it to the approach that you take in Reckitt, are they going in the right direction? Is that the right sort of structure that they should be applying to really start to embed this eradication of embedding sustainable procurement down through their supply chain?
Yeah, no, exactly. I was reading through the article this morning, and I think there were sort of three key elements that really sort of resonated with the approach that certainly Reckitt is taking, but also some of our peers. And let me talk to you about three of them. So I think that the first is around corporate purpose. So, one thing that they've done first and foremost is talk around the purpose of the company beyond just generating financial returns for their shareholders. This is increasingly important because what we're starting to see now is, given the growth in societal expectations around the roles that corporates and brands play in addressing some of the social and environmental challenges of today, be it climate change, human rights, etc. Companies now are having to put a corporate purpose in place, which really outlines, what are they specifically doing above delivering a social or a specific financial benefit. And I think the words of Simon Sinek, he really encapsulates this well by saying people don't buy what you do, people buy why you do it. Right. So what we're starting to see now is companies and sort of frame their corporate and hence their sustainability engagements around, what does the world specifically need? What do we as a company uniquely offer? How can we still create economic value? Because ultimately we're still businesses and we still need to generate shareholder return. And then finally, what do people at a company feel passionate about? Because ultimately it's the people who are creating the products, selling the services. And ultimately, if you make sure that they're behind what you're doing, they're more likely to sort of drive, stay with the business, attract new talent, etc. So I think corporate purpose is key, and I like how they framed it. And that's exactly what Reckitt does ourselves. The second area is around sustainability and ESG. And this is where Shido talk about their Win 2030 sustainability, Win 2030 and beyond sustainability strategy. That's the next tier down. Companies such as ours, we can't fix all the world's problems, but what we can do, building on our purpose, is really identify what are those key sustainability or ESG areas where we are best placed to leverage our supply chain, our operations, or our brands to have a meaningful impact. And I think also as part of this is how you frame it and how you embed sustainability into the business. We at Reckitt, we launched our 2030 sustainability ambitions in March last year, and we moved away from calling it a strategy, because ultimately there is one strategy, and that's the business strategy. And we see sustainability as an integral part of delivering that strategy and delivering sustained financial growth for the business moving forward. So that's, again, what I see in terms of that second tier, in terms of coming through that. And then the final point is around then how you engage your suppliers. I think many businesses will realize that actually a bulk of their sustainability impact is actually within their supply chain, outside of their direct control and influence. So having clear sustainability policies around what the expectation is of your suppliers, having clear engagement programs by which you engage your suppliers to tackle issues such as modern slavery is absolutely key. And I think having a traditional comply or die based approach here doesn't work. And I think procurement have a very important role to play with looking at how they, how they utilize the commercial leverages, levers available to them to try to incentivize suppliers to play their part.
I think that's a really interesting comment at the end there about that sort of comply or die, because I think I remember when I certainly started working in and looking at this in detail about modern slavery issues and running workshops, talking to people about the challenges. There was very much of, oh, well, if they cross the line, then we'll just strike them off. There's always that attitude to it. But clearly, I'm sure as we get through today's discussions, we'll realise that isn't the way to do it. There does need to be some incentive as in, you've got to do this, but work with you to do it, rather than just do it by diktat and hope that it works, because clearly that's not going to embed its way down through the supply chain, is it? I mean, I think that's what we're all realizing, and maybe you may be a bit farther ahead in Reckitt than other companies in looking at how you actually do that.
No, exactly. And, we've got many examples, and I think we can sort of bring that to life as we get to the panel discussion later around how, simply saying to suppliers, fix the problem and tell us once it's done doesn't work. There needs to be a discussion around, joint investment. Suppliers will invest in making the right changes, but they need to know they have a business with you for a couple of years. If you're on very short commercial contracts, what is the incentive for the supplier to do that? So that partnership orientated approach is really key here.
Yeah, I don't know. Obviously, I'll do it again. Shiseido is in Japan, and obviously that comes more naturally to Japanese organisations, and often it's more challenging to do it in other environments, particularly where it's very competitive sort of manufacturing environments. But is that something you're seeing? Is suppliers are wanting to do it with you? I mean, are you seeing that sort of reaction from suppliers?
Yeah, no, for sure we are, because I think a lot of this, and it depends how you frame the conversation with suppliers, is actually about building business resilience. We're seeing the impacts of climate change and water scarcity, and if you look at many of our products, it requires water to be produced. So if suppliers in water scarce regions, for example, are not managing water correctly, or if you've got a supplier that's utilizing modern slavery, for example, for goods being imported into the European Union or goods being imported into the US, where there are very stringent laws in place now around the use of forced labor in any phase of that value chain, that can result in significant business disruption. So I think it's getting suppliers to also see that, this isn't just the right thing to do. This is an element of, business resilience. So yeah, that's how we generally sort of frame it in the discussion.
That's really good.
Suppliers are therefore willing to support us.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for that, David. I've already seen there's quite a few comments going into chat as well, so I'll come back to those in a minute in terms of some of the thoughts that people have got about this topic. But I'd like to bring our other two guests in first. So we're going to be joined by Mike Ford, who's the global lead of sustainability and the EHS at Avetta, and Hayley Gauntlet, who's a director at QBL Consulting. So welcome to the two of you. Thank you for joining us on Supply Chain Talk today. I'm going to ask you both to do a very quick intro to yourself first, and then we'll come back into the topic. So maybe Hayley first. We'd like to quick intro to you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Hayley Gauntlet. I have been working in this field now for 20-something plus years. I've worked in both retail and manufacturing for much longer, in fact. But I became an ethical auditor, traveling globally and going into supply chains to talk to workers and help support workers in supply chains for large retail organizations. I initially worked for Boots the Chemist, so retail, and then moved to Tesco and worked for Tesco for 9 years, again, working globally on some of the most heinous programs in terms of modern slavery, things like the Thai fishing trade, and helping try to put together global programs to actually eradicate this. In 2016, I decided to become an independent consultant, and now I work with quite a significant number of FTSE 100 companies, helping advise them on strategy, but also helping with investigation in supply chains.
That's great. Thank you, Hayley. And Mike?
Thank you, Duncan. Mike Ford. I'm the global lead for sustainability and EHS within Avetta. I started my career initially in the EHS field in the early 90s. And then in the early 2000s, moved into the human rights, ethical auditing, responsible sourcing, because I felt the health and safety aspect and the human rights and modern slavery prevention were a good marriage together. I moved into ethical auditing, trained ethical auditors around the globe, worked on some of the major ethical initiatives, especially in the IT industry, training their auditors in China and other parts of Southeast Asia. Now working in the industry where we work with clients, where we help develop content to undertake the due diligence aspect of their supply chains.
Okay, thanks, Mike. And maybe stay with you, Mike. I mean, you actually suggested this article as a good article for us to focus on as a news item. And I think one of the reasons you said that is because while this, sort of building on the conversation I was just having with David, while there's certain companies who are really driving this forward, I think you were saying that in your experience, there's a lot of companies who haven't even started to embed some of the practices and ways of working they need to. And is that what you're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, it's a really interesting, because when I read this article, I thought this is really interesting, because I've seen a difference geographically. I think the European market is by a long way more advanced in this area than other parts of the world. We work with a lot of the major global brands who, to be candid, are doing a good job internally, but have never really, and to David's point, have never really looked at their supply chain yet. That's where, when you're importing a supplier service, you're importing risk. Now that risk is going to vary incrementally based on what they do, and very rarely have they looked at it, especially at the due diligence, the pre-contract award. So we're starting to see a move because of this ESG frenzy that we're now starting to see. Companies are starting to take it a little bit more seriously, and I think it's one of these initiatives that will stick. So from my perspective, we're actually starting to see companies asking the question, but not really knowing where to start, because what they're scared of in many cases, and rightly so, is that when they're asking these questions, they're not perceived as a barrier to doing business with them. Because the reality is there's some parts of the world where certain skill sets are in very short supply. And if the supplier doesn't want to answer those questions, they can easily go somewhere else and provide that service. So that's what we're kind of seeing at the moment. It's a real mixed bag. Some are very advanced. Certain sectors are advanced more than others. I've done a lot of work in the retail sector, and I felt from my experience, the work they were doing was way ahead of some of the other sectors that we're working in at the moment.
I see you nodding there, Hayley. I mean, are you very much in the same boat there in terms of what you see in the work that you're doing? Because you said there you're working with a lot of the sort of FTSE 100 type companies. I mean, what's your take?
No, I absolutely agree with what Mike said there. If you look at where retail have been and what they've uncovered and where they've pushed forward and where they've driven forward for their programs, it's absolutely groundbreaking compared to other industries. I work a lot across a lot of industries, things like construction, finance, logistics, but retail is at the top of its game in terms of how it approaches these things, because they've been in it for so much longer. And I think that's the key thing. And it's interesting to see that that Shiseido are doing this. One of the things that I thought was very interesting about what they've said in this was, I don't think they're doing anything groundbreaking for most of the things they're doing. Yes, they're coming up to scratch with some of the people who are already there. So like the Tesco's, the M&S, the Unilevers, all of those people, PepsiCo, they all have really good programs in place. Now, what they have said on that article is that they're refusing to work in high-risk areas, which I thought was quite interesting. So whereas other organizations are saying, we'll work in high-risk areas, we know that we have high risk. One of the comments I noticed just coming up is about cotton coming out of China, for example. Now, lots of suppliers still take cotton out of China. And the cotton supply chain is very, very fragmented and very difficult to trace. So, we see that, there's more commitments from some areas than there are from the others. So I completely concur with what Mike was saying about, what we've been doing, sort of like European side is way ahead, that there are things better to do. But for me, I think the next step for business is really tying their directors down to ESG targets and remuneration around those targets.
And do you think that'll happen? I mean, maybe David, I'll come to you on that, as you're one of those directors. I mean, do you see this as being something that will embed itself into objectives, targets, goals, bonus schemes as we go forward?
So yes, the short answer is yes. And I think just two reflections just before sort of answering that specifically. I think on Hayley's point, brand companies and retailers, because they are very visible brands, they've been focusing on supply chain sourcing for a long, long time, because consumers do not want to buy a brand that has had some form of abuse or scandal within the supply chain. So this is why, compared to maybe B2B businesses and others, that we're further sort of advanced in that space. In terms of objectives, we have had certainly in objectives across relevant functions, key ESG indicators. What we're now working on around, how do we link this more to variable pay, specifically to Haley's point. So that's something that we're obviously exploring as well.
Okay, I was just reading a couple of the questions that came in, and Helen Carter's obviously added quite a few questions in here. But I think one probably plays to a couple of the comments that you just made there about, and maybe where you started from as well, David, is that you can start collaborating, partnering with tier one suppliers because you've got a bit of, I think you used the phrase commercial leverage. Yeah, there is a bit of an ability to influence those. But when you get beyond tier one, it becomes a lot greater challenge, and maybe some of the issues that we see in our supply chains are not necessarily tier one; they're below that. So I think the question from Helen was how important are tools like collaboration and SRM going further into the supply chain. Really important to start to really understand how exposed you are, and do something about it further down. And maybe Haley, that comes to your point as well about certain risk areas where it's happening. It's just how do you find it and do something. I'd just be interested in your responses onto that question.
Yeah, I think that there are some really, really notable examples of where you can actually tackle it at massively down the supply chain. I mentioned the Thai fishing issues. Back in 2014, there was a massive expose with a lot of the supermarkets implicated at the time, not just UK ones, but obviously US and European. I've been supporting that program. But, the program was a collaborative program, which resulted in two really big collaborative initiatives, the Seafood Task Force and the Asara Institute. Now, both of those are working directly on the ground to identify migrants at risk, generally migrants, but people at risk, vulnerable people at the bottom of supply chains, and actually rescue those people. Now, that is the only way. If you've got something that's a long way down your supply chain, you have to be lobbying government. You have to, and the Thai government was lobbied considerably by the brands and retailers to actually get movement in that area. You need to be working on the ground with organizations in the area, but you need to be collaborating and actually supporting this, because not one company can do this in isolation.
Yeah, no, and just to build on that, I completely agree. If we take palm oil as an example, and everyone is aware of the human rights and environmental issues within palm oil, again, the issues are, really, really deep in the supply chain at mill and plantation level. You have huge supply chains, so you can't physically audit them all. So, working in partnership with others to get the traceability and then do collaborative projects to drive systemic change at that level, including advocacy to the government, is key. And this is what we're doing a lot of consumer goods and retailers through the Consumer Goods Forum, where we have a human rights coalition of action whose target is to end forced labor. And part of that is how we invite collectively as consumer goods members, our palm oil suppliers, to really talk about the human rights due diligence that they do in their supply chain. And then we've got a stream around government advocacy at a Malaysian government level to address some of the systematic levels there. So they're the sort of approaches that ultimately need to be deployed when you're looking at further upstream issues.
Yep.
I think one of the things I would add as well, Duncan, is when we're launching new supplier evaluation programs or adding this due diligence content to existing programs, I would say without exception, not one client realizes how much work is actually required to get even a small amount of success in this area. It's an incredibly difficult process to launch. And one of the areas where many of them fail is they simply don't communicate their expectations. Without exception, they just simply don't explain why they're asking these questions and what it is they're trying to achieve from it. We can make statements and we want to abolish this, stop that. But the reality is you've got to be realistic. And many of the organizations I work with want to go from 0 to 100 in one go. And it doesn't work. And you end up with a lot of information that you very, very often don't know what to do with. So it has to be an incremental approach with proper stages and programs and with key objectives at each stage. And that's the approach we've been taking with clients who are going into this area for the first time. Even if they've been doing it internally, they don't realize you can't use what you're doing internally and then apply that to the supply chain. You have to take a completely different approach. And we've had some who want to go from tier 1 through to tier 3, tier 4. You know, to the guys that are on the panel now, you know, once you get into some countries, once you get below tier 2, it gets murky very quickly. And so you've got to have realistic objectives. We're not going to solve the problems of the world, but we can do something. And that would be my takeaway, is when we're launching these things, is to make sure the things we're trying to ask and obtain responses to, we explain what we're asking. Because in some cultures, some things are deemed acceptable, and in our culture it may not be. So we need to explain to them why that might be and what we want to try and achieve from that, and also not try to be too forceful in imposing our own cultural standards. Because I mean this is textbook stuff, but it's something that if you don't do that, I'm working with some clients at the moment who are demanding certain standards, and some of the challenges from my own experience was hard enough getting someone to wear steel toe cap shoes and a hard hat, and then you suddenly expect them to go 3 or 4 or 5 levels straight away. So that would be my kind of very simplistic observation with looking at the question there.
But that does raise a couple of points to me, and this maybe comes to a question from James Smith as well. I mean, there is regulation in place. You know, there is the UK Modern Slavery Act. Companies aren't, you know, I think his question was only 40% of companies are found to be, 40% are not to be fully complying with the Act. I think it's probably more than that, you know, in terms of actually really driving the changes through. So how can you make more companies comply? But the question probably is, this is an investment, isn't it? I mean, if you really go to do what you described there as a very complex analysis of your supply chain, audit it effectively, go work with your suppliers, that's an investment. And when we've got big inflationary pressures, we've been through a tough recessionary period with COVID. I mean, surely, how do we get companies to really take this seriously and then invest the time, the resources, the effort that's needed to do what they need to do?
I must admit, I think it's a multi-pronged attack. I think legislation obviously is really important. And I think strengthening of the Modern Slavery Act needs to happen. There has been parliamentary time is going to be allowed for that, but at the moment the changes haven't happened. Obviously everything's been held up with COVID, so there's been no time made in Parliament for it. But there are some recommendations that are going through that are going to be tabled. Those are sort of like to basically give it bigger teeth, more than, you know, to basically say that, you know, if you falsify anything on your statement, you could be fined up to £20 million. So that's one of the things that are actually saying around the Modern Slavery Act. But I think it's also the other prongs are consumers, and we know that Gen Zs now and millennials have a very, very different mindset about what they want for the future. They don't want to buy from a company that has no purpose, and it comes back to what David was saying earlier about, you know, that sense of purpose, the corporate purpose, that they want something more than just buying that product. They're actually buying into a social idea as well. So there's consumers who can play a part, but there's also investors as well. And I've got to be honest, in the last few years, that's where I've seen the biggest change from what people are saying around investment. Now, it was Robert G. Eccles that did the study over 20 years to pick out, to basically demonstrate that businesses that were more sustainable outperformed their peers time and time again, both with profit, with sales, customer retention and loyalty, and with employee retention and loyalty. Now, it's taken business a long time to get that, but actually business is now very much focused on it. If you look at BlackRock, go to their website, look at how they're investing and what's important to them. You know, one of the biggest investment companies in the world. Now, they are fully focused on sustainability and how people achieve that and what it means to them. And, you know, they put out one of their videos that came out a little bit during sort of like COVID, was basically showing how instead of what they thought would happen in COVID with the need for ESG to sort of like take a back seat to actually make way for the economy, it actually the investments in more sustainable businesses grew. And that's what they saw, and they were quite surprised at that. But it just shows how strong that feeling is from the investment industry, and how important sustainability is.
But I think, just to add to that, if I may, investors are shrewd, and the reason they're now concerned about it is they actually see the financial risk posed by if companies do not take sustainability issues seriously. You've got the increased taxation coming. Associated with increases in regulation, which will only continue to increase as governments try to address social inequalities through increasing, minimum wage thresholds, environmental carbon taxes coming down the pipeline. So if companies don't start decarbonizing or improving that now, they will incur greater cost in future. And as Hayley said, around the consumer element, it takes years to build up a reputation of a brand. It can be destroyed in just one incident. So again, if you're managing human rights issues and environmental issues in the supply chain, investors look at that and think, in terms of delivering sustained long-term growth for the company, it's a safer bet. And this is why you're seeing that sort of growth in shareholder interest.
And so do you see that as being a stronger driver? Because I think there's a comment in from Thomas Arendt, welcome back Thomas, saying how can consumers contribute to the elimination of slavery across our supply chain? I think what I just heard is consumers have a role to play, but is the greater driver going to come from the board, the investors, the people who actually are in the seats of power, who will drive change down through companies? I mean, is that? I think that's what I'm hearing from both of you. I think that's more likely to be.
I agree. I think it's both as well. I agree with David. I think because investors are starting to understand there's lots of research into purchasing habits and social habits around Gen Zs and millennials. There's a lot. Accenture report, for example, is one that's come out in the last couple of years, just showing where their mentality has moved, what their purchasing habits are going to be for the future. That gets investors thinking, as well. So I think, is that multi-pronged approach?
I think one of the things I would add as well is I think the investor one is by far going to be the stronger one, because the consumer issue is quite fickle, because you can have people banging the drum and they're dressed head to toe in fast fashion, and that's just the cynical side of me looking at that. So I think sometimes when you look at prices and you look at some of these issues around price issues and by being able to buy things cheap, a lot of the time individuals who may be completely distressed at some of these issues will still keep buying the product because it's cheap. So I think we have to look at both. I think I agree with both what has been said, but I think the investor one will have far more clout than the consumer. I think the consumer is always going to be an issue, but like I say, I find it sometimes can be a little bit fickle when you speak to people and they're dressed in fashion that has gone through all kinds of processes in low cost economies.
Yeah. So there's the driver for doing something as a business. I think maybe if we move on and talk about maybe some of the things that companies should be doing or can be doing in this space. There's a couple of questions. There's one from Nigel Strutt. So welcome to you, Nigel. Was talking about how are you able to start to do proper due diligence and work with tier 2 and tier 4 in a project environment, where actually you're bringing a team together, you're doing a project, and then you're moving away from it. Whereas in a FMCG environment, you've got longer term suppliers, longer term commitments. So are the tactics that we should take in a project environment? So that's sort of one question. And then the other question I think is just come in looking at SMEs, from Carl Morgan, which says it's very well for big companies to sort of set this up because it's part of the purpose, it's part of the drive to do things better here. But what are the sort of things that a smaller company should be doing? And maybe the same answer to both questions. It's what are the things that smaller suppliers down through the chain should be doing, and where you have commercial leverage, you can maybe drive it harder. But if it's a project environment, maybe it's a bit more challenging. Two questions there. Open it up.
I'm quite happy to answer if on one of those. I'm currently working with one of the big energy providers, renewable energy providers in the UK, and we're working on a project basis. So there are different challenges. So because you don't have necessarily a longer period of supply. You might have, say, 5 years of supply for those projects coming through. They're not smaller projects than that, and so I don't have experience of working on projects that are only like a couple of months or anything. So I can only give my experience on working with projects that are sort of like slightly longer. But you do face challenges, and the leverage aspect is harder, I would say, because with the when I've worked in retail supply chains, there are seasonal products and things like that, but a lot of stuff you actually have long-term supply chains where people have you've traded with them for quite 20 years or something. So there are those long-lived supply chains, whereas on a project, getting the leverage, and even just to the point of getting telephone calls with major contractors, their main contractors, and then looking down through the lower tiers into contractors that maybe were operating out in Dubai and out obviously out in the United Arab Emirates. It is harder to get that traction and that leverage. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try, and basically a lot of the people that I'm going to and finding out there are hidden gems in those business of sustainability and human rights, good practice. But it's actually finding those out and actually working with them. But it does take, it is harder. It is harder, but it's just about perseverance and keeping on trying, because the other option is not doing anything, and that's not an option as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I think one of the things that I would add, because I think the question about the smaller suppliers is a key one, because if you look at the levels in, say, Australia or the UK, the turnover levels for the modern slavery statement, they're pretty high. And a lot of the issues happen way below those thresholds. And one of the issues I found when I was doing ethical auditing was that many of the programs that are out there are not helping. It's because they're not scalable. Because the problem is they're asking the same questions of a company that employs 50,000 to a company that employs 50. And very often the approaches that are being asked of these companies isn't relative to the size and demographic of the supplier. And I think that therein lies one of the issues. One of the products that we've started working with is trying to scale the approach. We're still asking key questions, which still gives the client visibility. It's not giving them as much detail as the full fat version, but using this smaller approach means the smaller supplier at least has a chance of being able to demonstrate some success and being able to achieve these things. Because if you start asking too much of this one size fits all approach, they'll give up and they'll go and work somewhere else, or they will hide things. And that's been my experience when I first started doing ethical auditing. And even now, we still see that. And I think if we could make the approach far more flexible, so we're still trying to achieve better working standards and better working practices that are not so bureaucratic, it won't be seen as so much of a challenge. It's actually seen as some added value, which will help them get more work and things like that. So I think it's a great question, because it applies to, it doesn't really matter what the geography is, it applies to every location that we work in globally. The smaller suppliers simply just throw their hands in the air and say, hey, what you're looking for, we don't understand. And it's no use asking us these things when we don't have the necessary competence or the understanding of the core subject. And if we could scale it down and then take them on that incremental path, it's far more productive than just hitting them with a big sledgehammer straight off. And I know from speaking to small family suppliers up in Scotland and things like that, they just didn't see it. And then it become a paper exercise just to get through the program.
Yeah, I do think, Mike, you've got some good points there as well. I also think that there's another way that we can look at it as well, which is kind of like drawing people into industry initiatives as well, because that's a way that that people can make a big difference, is actually being part of their industry. Lots of people, for example, if you look at the food industry, you've got FNET, so the Food Network for Ethical Trade. Now, what they were sort of like some suppliers that came together and said, actually, we need to start working together. to actually address this, because they were actually having to deal with sort of like some big retailers, and they may not have had the scale and the size themselves. So by coming together as an industry, that's another way you can crack it. But I do think, I do think that due diligence isn't one size fits all. And I mean, a lot of the clients I work with have a lot of very small suppliers in their supply chains. And you can't do it. It's not a one size fits all. Due diligence, it's a variety of different things. It's a toolbox. And unless you actually take the right tools from the toolbox, you're not going to get the job done. And so it's a very simple analogy, but that's basically, what I try and sort of like say to my clients is, you've got to have a range of options for people, because, you will do exactly what you said about driving bad behavior under, people hiding things and lying, and you don't really want to drive those behaviors.
I'm interested in your thoughts on this, David.
I think I completely agree with what Hayley and Mike have mentioned. Certainly with Reckitt, we have a toolbox of tools that we're developing. I think first and foremost, and this can be done with any company, just first look at who you're buying, where you're buying from. That can be done, certainly at a tier 1 level fairly easily if you're a small company. Then if you sort of overlay, public resources, again, you can get for free. It can be found on Google, research into modern slavery, and then you'll be able to sort of risk profile countries, sectors that are particularly high risk. Once you've got that, then just start engaging with some of those suppliers in those high-risk regions. Understand, their understanding, their awareness, through self-assessments, potentially you can do a site visit. Again, these are still fairly inexpensive ways of doing the due diligence. And then engage with NGOs. We have partners with a range of NGOs. Again, they will happily partner with any business, however big or small they are, to impart their expertise, to help bring in their network of expertise in particularly high-risk regions, to help companies better understand the risks and take action. And I think the final bit is technology. We'll be announcing in our next Modern Slavery Act a collaboration with a tech provider and another global brand, where we developed a very inexpensive, we supported the development of a very inexpensive tool that enables you to cascade a very simple questionnaire through multiple tiers of the migrant worker supply chain, to really understand the recruitment practices happening there, and potentially areas of risk that you can then focus and have an in-depth discussion. Again, showing how technology can be used to scale due diligence in a very cost-effective way. So yeah, multiple tools here.
And I think that's an interesting point about that sort of use of technology here, because I think maybe comes back to I think the point you were making, Mike, about how hard it is to actually go and fully understand your supply chain and map it and understand what's there, but actually start to expose some of the issues. So, I mean, are there other technology solutions that are going to help more in this space to actually get that visibility and the understanding of what's really going on through the supply chain?
Absolutely. And there are quite a few out there at the moment. You'll look at something, for example, like EcoVadis or STAR. Both of them very, very good systems at drawing in a lot of information. Now, regardless whether that be kind of like environmental, social, or around governance, and things like bribery and corruption and things like that, they've got fantastic systems. Now, are they accessible to everybody? And I think that at the moment, no, I don't think that technology is accessible to everybody because they can be quite pricey. But I do think in the future there will be other options. There's a lot of work, as David said, at the moment. There's lots of options for you to actually get out mobile communications to workers. So, for example, the Asara Institute in Thailand, that's one of the main streams of work they've been doing, is basically getting mobile communications and questionnaires onto fishing vessels, which is obviously quite a difficult thing to do. So, there's a lot around blockchain as well at the moment. And don't ask me about the technology because I have no idea. All right, so we won't talk about blockchain, but there's a lot about blockchain and modern slavery and how we monitor and manage human rights risks out there. And I think those are going to be the things that really will help for the future.
And I think just to build on that about accessibility, this tool, which you will know probably in the next month or so, is a very low price point to exactly address that issue about, a lot of the other tools out there are very expensive. Yeah. It also is more than just a self-assessment, because it integrate worker voice surveys over the self-assessments completed by the multiple actors in the migrant worker supply chain. So there's that combination of the integrated worker voice surveys to understand from the perspective of workers their recruitment corridor and the journey, overlay with a self-assessment that actually to a degree validates the practices that actors are declaring in the supply chain, rather than you having to send physical auditors all around the world. So it's the combination of the two that's really filling a unique gap in the market at the moment.
It's really interesting, and I'm sure we'll all be looking out for the announcements when you make them, David, in terms of what's there and how it works in practice. Because you're right, that's the big steps forward that's needed, and I think that's the collaboration one. I think the point you made as well, Hayley, is really important. You know, the sectors coming together to focus on this, and I know I've been quite closely involved in working with the construction sector in the UK. You know, and again, there's a supply chain sustainability school which was set up to actually help the SMEs to understand, to learn, to train about good practices and how to embed them. And it's those sorts of initiatives that will get to SMEs and give them some of the guidance and support they need. So, I mean, Mike, any further comments on that one?
Yeah, I think the technology is an interesting one because, I mean, we're a SaaS business, but I still think it has some limitations. I've seen a lot of inquiries recently asking for, can we do verification via OCR and AI? My personal feelings are, when we're talking something as important as human rights, my jury's out on that completely, because it's very easy to manipulate data, very easy to manipulate certain types of evidence. So there's lots of talk around the use of technology, around verification. That is another side, but the other area is the digitization of the supply chain and how that's mapped. I still think it's a massive job and very, very difficult to do. And I think there has to be some creativity. And I'm not sure whether it was David or Hayley who mentioned this before, but it's about being creative with your tier ones, your tier twos, and increasing contract length or preferred supplier statuses and things to get a better buy-in. Because a lot of the time, once you get below tier one, there's very little loyalty to you as a client. And so there has to be a magnet or a hook into them to keep them engaged. And I've not really seen many products out there at the moment that have been that successful, apart from some of the more established ones like the Nikes and the PepsiCos, etc.
Right. So we've probably got time for one more question, actually, which time has absolutely flown by here. And there's probably one from Carl Thomas, which is probably a good one to end on. It says, if you could suggest one practical action that an organization could take now that would help them to raise awareness of modern slavery in their supply chain, what would that be? So that's always the final, really good one for the end of a panel. Give me one thing that you could do to really sort of focus and raise awareness of in the supply chain.
My thought would be to really understand the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. They have a very simple framework that, if applied within a business, gives everybody the kind of like the framework that they would need to actually tackle not just modern slavery, but actually from a full human rights due diligence program. That framework, I know it's basically commit, assess, act, remedy, monitor, and communicate, and that's your framework basically. And that's really what everyone should be doing. And it's a real starting point for a lot of businesses to actually move forward, is actually follow that framework and actually get yourselves moving on it.
I think practically from my side, very simple. Each and every buyer, if you're buying products, just ask the question, where is it made from? Are you using migrant labor? Do you know where your migrant labor comes from? Just beginning the discussion and asking these questions can then result in you already having a sense of, is there something more concerning that you need to engage with? And that's when you can start building in at the commercial contract point, the expectations you have around, paying, the employer pays for any migrant worker that you hire to ensure that they haven't incurred fees. You may commission an audit to check the accommodation of migrant workers living in accommodation. So that's something really practical that buyers can sort of take this forward.
That's great.
I think from my perspective, and I'm going to build on what both Hayley and David said, the two things for me is engagement and education. And the education part comes in the procurement process. The number of procurement personnel I meet on a very regular basis simply have no idea how this figures in the procurement process. Are very much driven around different factors, obviously price being one, but what happens, what should they be looking for? So there's an education issue there, but also the education within the supply chain. And this is about the expectations, educating your suppliers as to why you're suddenly introducing these things. In many cases, this is the first time they're being asked. I mean, I'm quite pragmatic about this. And I think the other thing, and someone else mentioned this, is get industry bodies involved, because if they drive it forward, even the really small companies, even the mom and dad type businesses, a lot of them are part of federations, whether it be a master builders or a small food initiative or something like that. Get engaged with those organizations so they can actually understand why these things are actually coming into play, what the value is to them in being able to do these things and so on. That's the key for me, because when we're conducting some of the basic due diligence, every single company has got to do things like eligibility to work checks. The number of organizations are asking, well, why are you asking me that? And they just simply don't know. Yet if this was in some kind of industry body or trade awareness or something like that, it just makes life a little bit easier. And for me, I'm a little bit more basic on that. I think if we can do that and do it in small steps, that would be the win-win for me.
That's great. Thank you. And thanks for all three of you for those final sort of comments. And well, thank you for a great discussion. It really has been brilliant. There's been so much we've covered. So from Hayley, Mike and David, thank you. There's been topics we haven't covered. When I was looking through the chat and the comments all about cotton and garment industry, we probably could have had a whole another session all about that and the whole complexities around on that sector and that industry. And maybe that's one we should come back to and have a further discussion on. But really do appreciate the three of you. Great insights, really good thought, and really good comments and reaction to the questions that were put to you. I need to give out a mug to the person for the best question. There's probably about 4 there, but I think the one from Carl Thomas, which was, was it Carl Thomas? Was around sort of the final thought was a really good one. But there's one before that talking about the SMEs. And I think that discussion around how do you really get this embedded down through the SMEs and the frameworks and the tools was probably the one that we should do. So I think it was Carl Morgan, I think it was, who actually got that one. So Carl Thomas, you can try again next time round. We'll get a mug on its way to you. So again, really do appreciate Hayley, Mike, David, for your time today. It's been a great discussion. Thanks to those in the audience who participated on chat and questions. It was really good to get those and to bring the whole topic to life. And next week on Supply Chain Talk, we're going to be talking about how we're going to use technology to combat future of knowledge loss and worker shortage. So that's going to be interesting to talk about how technology may fill some of the gaps that we've got in terms of knowledge and the skill shortage that everyone's facing at the moment. So look forward to that discussion. But Hayley, Mike, David, thank you very much today. And thanks everyone for joining Supply Chain Talk. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks.